Good afternoon. Well, it was a year ago today that New York State was struck by a natural disaster. You'll remember a 5.8 magnitude earthquake hit New York State exactly a year ago, August 23rd, 2011. This building was evacuated. Other buildings were shook up and people were shook up around the state, but fortunately it was little real damage to the state. While we were responding to that unusual event of an earthquake, that same day, that evening in fact, we were beginning to track a storm that was then crossing the Bahamas and to take precautionary actions for any storm track the storm might take in New York State. And as you can see, I think on the chart to the right, what a monster storm that was that eventually became Hurricane Irene, the first of two major storms to hit New York State. We were less fortunate with Irene and subsequently with Lee than we were with the earthquake that occurred a year ago today. But that began a series of events. August 28th, Hurricane Irene hit New York, and today we want to mark the devastation that those storms caused here in New York, as well as the unprecedented response efforts, the outpouring of goodwill among New Yorkers that saved many lives and helped communities across the state rebuild. The impact of the storm was staggering, really, by any measure. Almost 400,000 people were evacuated over the course of the two storms, over 1 million households without power, significant damage to water systems, to critical infrastructure, including many bridges and roads in New York State. The state acted, I think, quickly and effectively, thanks some of the people that are here in the room, thanks especially to first responders around the state, sending emergency equipment and personnel to communities that were hit the hardest, and pitching in to help towns and villages rebuild in the storm's aftermath. And that's an effort that still continues today in some communities. Today we're going to issue a report, New York Response, and that report schedules or chronicles in detail some of the work that's been done over the last year and gives you a sense of the scale and the scope of the efforts that were undertaken by the state of New York and by people in their own communities. Some really great stories in there. To date, by the numbers, over $574 million in state aid directed to communities to help them recover and rebuild. Of this more than $570 million, $277 million in direct state aid to families, to businesses and farms, to municipalities. Those are direct payments. The 7 hardest hit counties, Broome, Delaware, Greene, Orange, Schoharie, Tioga, and Essex County, of that amount received approximately $137 million of the $277 million, and those counties were very hard hit. In addition, or I really should say, of that total of $570 million, you have $297 million that we spent to rebuild roads and bridges after the destruction caused by the storms. That's kind of a one-year snapshot of what the funding of the program looks like, and that money is all out now in the communities assisting. In fact, I just came back from Margaretville today, where, as you know, the governor was in Margaretville on August 28th during the storm, literally in the middle of the storm and the floods, and then returned without fanfare by himself with me 2 days later to see what the effects of the storm were, and it was quite devastating. You know, the damage that water can do. If you haven't seen it firsthand, it's hard to believe. And a part of that, and one of the things we saw, was that without a lot of resources on the ground at that point, it was only a day and a half after the storm, the whole community had mobilized to start rebuilding. People had their tools and their lumber. It was still very difficult. You couldn't get in because the roads were still closed at that point, 24 to 48 hours later. But using materials and whatever they had with no power, they were already beginning the cleanup, and that spurred the governor's idea for Labor for Your Neighbor, which occurred on Labor Day when I think almost 2,000 volunteers from around the state pitched in and helped, and we went back actually to Margaretville and Prattsville and other towns all throughout the state. To see what it is like today in that community, it's an incredible contrast. Visited 4 businesses today, visited the Fresh Market supermarket, which was the first place we landed a day and a half after the storm, which had been, half the building had been just wiped away, and then the remainder of it, millions of dollars worth of inventory was gone inside. Buildings had been undermined throughout the town. Every business closed. 4 feet of water in most of the businesses. You know, this is a river town, and the river just absolutely overwhelmed it. Going there today, it couldn't be a bigger contrast. The businesses stayed, many of them with state assistance, and that's what we heard from them today. And they're able to stay open. Their ability to stay open has helped not only shoppers to come in and keep the businesses open, but also local producers. So in the supermarket, I met with a man who bakes bread locally, and we purchased some locally produced maple syrup. And producer after producer, the farmers that we helped and the businesses that we helped, provide their products to the retailers, so they're benefiting, and then the individuals who come and shop there. So we were there, we're at a cheese shop, we're at a gun shop that the governor himself had visited, and one after another, they said, you know, if we all were watching each other to see what the other business owners would do. The gun shop owner said, I live behind here. I didn't know if I really wanted to put this up, but we got the aid. I said, I'm going to stick it out. And it was like a rolling effect throughout the town where people said, I have the confidence, we're going to rebuild, we're going to stay. And the thing that was music to my ears today, and we heard it from every business owner in these new businesses that are reopening, said, my facility, my business is better today than it was a year ago. It's a better constructed, better facility. It looks great, and I encourage everyone to go out and visit Margaretville and spend some money out there in addition. So there's some good work. There's also work to do, which I'll talk about in a couple of minutes. We had a lot of people throughout the state that helped in this effort over the last year. I have 3 representatives of the state with us to talk about specific areas of business, our work with municipalities, farming, and our emergency services operation, how that's changed. We have Ken Adams, Empire State Development Corporation, President and CEO. President and CEO of the Environmental Facilities Corporation, Matt Driscoll, is with us, and Commissioner of Homeland Security and Emergency Services, Jerry Hauer, is with us, and I'd like to ask them each to come up in turn and provide their update.
All right, thank you, Howard. Good afternoon. I'm Ken Adams. I'm the President and CEO and Commissioner of New York State Empire State Development. In the aftermath of Hurricane Irene and Tropical Storm Lee, across the state in areas severely impacted by the storms, we saw what were once thriving businesses struggling to survive because of the damage they suffered from the storms. We recognized that the recovery of our communities depended on local businesses having the resources they needed to get back to business. So under the leadership of Governor Cuomo, New York State made business recovery a top priority, and we matched that commitment with the full spectrum of resources for those who needed it most. Working together with the governor, the state legislature allocated tens of millions of dollars through the Business Flood Recovery Grant Program and other initiatives to help employers rebuild as soon as possible. Currently, 581 eligible entities across the state that sustained direct flood-related damage as a result of Hurricane Irene or Tropical Storm Lee will receive a total of $7.9 million in assistance through the Business Flood Recovery Grant Program, examples of which Howard just mentioned. The grants provide up to $20,000 to the small businesses, farms, multiple dwellings, and non-for-profits that qualified for the program. Many small businesses that suffered significant damage but received little assistance from their insurance received these much-needed grants from the state so that they could reopen and open their doors to local consumers. The governor and the legislature passed special legislation to help companies that experienced devastation due to natural disasters, in this case, the floods, such as BAE in Broome County. In that case, because of the governor's leadership, BAE, which announced after the flooding that it would not be returning to its Johnson City facility in the southern tier, agreed to stay, retaining nearly 1,400 jobs and keeping one of the largest employers in that area right here in New York State. In addition, the governor's $15 million Agricultural and Community Recovery Fund has taken the lead in helping small farms and farming communities get back on track, and that includes several components. $3 million to assist Main Street businesses in more than a dozen communities in the 6 counties that were hardest hit. To date, more than $1.9 million of these funds have been dispersed directly to more than 160 businesses and building owners to help cover the costs of repairs. More than $2 million in emergency funds have already gone to 210 farms in 23 counties to mitigate the impact of livestock, feed, and crops lost as a result of the storms. $5 million to help rehabilitate farmland, the actual land damaged by the storms. And to date, $4 million of that has been provided to 564 farms in dozens of affected counties. When I talk to business owners in communities that were hard hit by the storms, I hear the same story. The state was there when help was needed the most. Governor Cuomo has time and time again been there for New York's businesses, large and small, and commerce in the towns and villages affected by Hurricane Irene and Tropical Storm Lee is on the road to recovery as a result of the governor's leadership. Next up, I'd like to introduce Matt Driscoll, who's President and CEO of the New York State Environmental Facilities Corporation. Matt?
Thanks, Ken. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Matt Driscoll. I'm President and CEO of the Environmental Facilities Corporation, and I was also co-chair of the Governor's Upstate Storm and Recovery Task Force. From my experience as mayor, I can say that seldom has New York State government marshaled its resources as effectively and as completely as it did in response to the storms of 2011, bringing critical supplies and assistance to towns and villages in affected areas. In the aftermath of the storms, our local towns and villages needed assistance, and they needed it quick. Governor Cuomo and his team were on the ground from communities in the North Country to villages in the Hudson Valley, listening to local officials and cutting red tape so assistance could be expedited. More than 11,000 pounds of food was distributed to hard-hit areas. At least 8,000 individuals and families received rebates totaling more than $7 million for new refrigerators, washers, dryers, and furnaces. At the governor's direction, state agencies also created emergency rules and procedures to more quickly deliver financial aid and services, ranging from insurance claims to business loans. The Department of State, for example, deputized local code enforcement officials to inspect flood-damaged buildings. In just 17 days, 13,000 buildings were inspected in 8 counties, clearing the way for financial assistance to these property owners. The Environmental Facilities Corporation created the Hurricane Emergency Loan Program, better known as HELP, to provide $25 million in interest-free loans for the repair of drinking water and wastewater systems damaged by these storms. Municipalities across the state took advantage of this program, applying for a total of over $18 million in loans ranging from between $500,000 and up to $1 million each. And when towns, villages, and counties struggled to pick up the local share of eligible cost from the recovery, Governor Cuomo directed the state to step in and pick up the tab, saving local governments millions of dollars. And still today, I run into people I have met during this past year who express their gratitude for how the state and their governor responded to this disaster. The bottom line is this: under Governor Cuomo's leadership, when local governments across New York needed help, the state stood ready, willing, and able to pitch in and help these municipalities get back on their feet. And the results are visible in communities all over the state today. Next, I'd like to invite Jerome Hauer, Commissioner of Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Services.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jerry Hauer. I'm the Commissioner of the Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Services. This storm was unprecedented in over the last 100 years. The last time we saw a storm like this was somewhere around 1938. Many of the areas of the state at that point were not densely populated. The impact was not as great. This was really an unprecedented storm, and it required an unprecedented response. Under the governor's leadership, we mustered over 1,700 state police, 3,200 National Guardsmen, 600 fire EMS personnel to respond to this disaster. Over 18,000 citizens were housed in 198 shelters throughout the state. The statewide response to Lee and Irene lasted over 3 months. In fact, the recovery still goes on and will go on for some period of time. While the response of the state agencies was admirable, as in any situation, we can learn a lesson on how to better respond into future disaster situations. We are looking at a new approach for dealing with our state's response to disasters. This approach, which the governor has spearheaded, is looking at a whole different way of dealing with the kinds of disasters that we can face in this state. We are strategically locating stockpiles of emergency equipment in 5 places throughout the state to meet humanitarian needs, be able to have equipment to do rescues, have equipment to support shelters, and other types of equipment that would be needed during a disaster. We are doing more preparedness at the state level than has ever been done before. We are preparing responders in a way that's never been done before in the state. For the first time ever, the commissioners in this state received disaster training at the governor's request and participated in the first commissioner level exercise to test and look at how we would deal with different types of emergencies. But we want to continue to make New York State a national leader in preparedness. And this fall, the governor will host a statewide emergency management summit. I'm quite excited about it. We have a program that's going to have national leaders in all fields: fire, police, terrorism, speakers from around the world that will focus on how to better respond to incidents, focus on the kinds of threats we face, speakers on active shootings that have recently occurred around the country. We want to be very proactive in the way we do business from here on out. So we are also going to be introducing a new credentialing system, and that process is getting underway as we speak. We want to ensure that New York is the best positioned state in the nation to deal with any kind of threat, any kind of disaster, anything that might hit us, anytime, day or night. And part of that, we want to ensure that our citizens are prepared as well. So based on the lessons learned from Irene and Lee, New York, under the guidance of Governor Cuomo, is committed to rebuilding and investing into making New York the best prepared state And as we want to ensure that we are prepared to respond to any kind of an incident, and that we've got the best emergency response system in the nation. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Commissioners. I've been driving around quite a bit over the last few weeks to some of the disaster areas, revisiting them, and the road conditions are really quite excellent. And you've seen some of the photos up here, and you see some of the photos to the left. Over 400 roads and bridges were closed during the course of this event. The governor signed an executive order to expedite repairs. We pioneered some methods of doing fast procurement and fast construction, and within 10 days after the storms, 80% of those roads and bridges had opened, and by 6 months later, every road and bridge that had been affected had been done. Route 42, Route 73, these critical routes in our state would have taken 6 months to reconstruct under normal procurement procedures, and they were done in a matter of weeks. A year later, though, it's still clear that we have more work to do in the recovery. There have been good successes throughout the state, but there also are challenges, and we're going to take some additional actions today because this is a long-term rebuilding effort. First, we're very fortunate that the state's flood control projects and dams performed as expected during these storms, but these kinds of extraordinary events make it clear that it's vitally important to maintain this infrastructure. Earlier this year, the governor and the legislature agreed to provide $100 million in state and federally leveraged funding through the New York Works program to repair the state's aging flood control and dam projects, the first commitment of its kind for this type of infrastructure in decades. One of the things we learned during that process is that most of the state's dams had not been inspected in many years, much less, or you didn't even know what to do to repair them because they hadn't been inspected. Today, we're announcing today, the Department of Environmental Conservation, that they selected contractors. We're beginning the work of $2.4 million in engineering assessments in dams across the state, which is an important first step to making sure that that infrastructure is brought into a good state of repair and condition. I mentioned I was in Margaretville, I was in Prattsville a few weeks ago. Prattsville and Greene County suffered greatly, and if you've been there, you know the devastation that it's seen. The town itself was almost washed away when the Schoharie Creek rose 15 feet in less than 12 hours. I saw that firsthand myself the day after the storm. We provided to Greene County, I think, in total, something like $47 million in funding, both through the transportation piece and the direct aid. But I think they need more help, and we're announcing today that an additional $500,000 will continue to help businesses and homeowners. This is for rebuilding businesses and homes primarily, and the governor is announcing that today, and also reserving an additional $500,000 for additional work if the $500,000 that we're announcing today proves to be insufficient. This is the right place to direct these additional resources. Prattsville needs more help in getting back on their feet. As I mentioned, many of you, I think, were in the Schoharie Valley during and after the storms in the northern Catskills. These were hard-hit areas. Today, we're also announcing grants of $145,000 to assist area fire and rescue squads to help purchase new equipment so that the staff in that area at the Blenheim-Gilboa Dam in particular, which is the dam site on the Schoharie, and the first responders in that surrounding community are better able to respond during any emergency. Finally, one thing I think that was really evident, and to this day is evident, is the lack of adequate cell service in some of these areas, particularly in that area of Schoharie County. You know, they depend on an alarm system with the dam, but it's not enough. They lost emergency communications for a period of time. Commissioner Howard is doing quite a bit of work on that. However, we're also announcing today that the New York Power Authority is issuing a request for proposals to expand cell service throughout that region and will help fund it. It's not always been economically viable for the private providers to do so. While I'm not happy about that situation, we do need to address it. So NYPA, because they're an operator of the dam there, will work to ensure effective communications. That will include placing new cell tower and other communications apparatus so that the Schoharie Valley has uniform communications throughout the region. In conclusion, looking back a year later, I think that the state's made great strides in recovering from Hurricane Irene, from Tropical Storm Lee. The tenacity of New Yorkers, buttressed by the support of the state, as well as local and federal government entities, as well as the private and nonprofit sectors, which really stepped up, has led to rebuilt and reopened homes, farms, roads, and businesses. So we're a year down. We salute the resolve, the commitment, the spirit of community in New York State that fuels that spirit in the state. And of course, there is still more work to do, and we'll stay with it for as long as it takes. With that, we'll open the floor to questions. Hearing none. Oh, okay. Go. Well, we'll continue to review the situation in the creek, Schoharie Creek. I think DEC is here, and they can respond more specifically to where they're heading right now. But it's clear that, Prattsville and the Schoharie Valley communities are in a vulnerable area, regardless of the issue with the dams that are up there. You have a huge amount of water, up in those mountains during a rain event, and they're channeled through a narrow gorge and then down into the valley. And so this has been a perennial problem. And at some point, there's, nature is very difficult to overcome. But DEC, I think, can provide you some more details on what they're doing at this point. I've never heard that proposal on the table, no.
Is there an updated?
It's specifically, it's for homeowners as well as for businesses. That's the money we'll use the money for both of those purposes. And homeowners just need some extra help. Many were uninsured. The federal funds didn't provide enough of a backstop for them. The state funding that's already been provided may not be enough to provide a critical mass, and so we're going to provide extra funding to these areas. It was a particularly uninsured area and uninsurable in some ways because of the natural structure of the environment there. So we've been meeting over the past several months with Prattsville officials, and I think all these gentlemen have been there, and Matt and Jerry. Now, do you want to say a word about your Prattsville meetings? Because we have been there as a regular presence, working with the local community to determine the best way to put additional resources in. Jerry, if you want to add anything to that.
Sure. We have been down in Prattsville on a regular basis looking at the projects to ensure that first of all, the creek is completely clean, there's no obstructions, so that we don't have any diversion of the water, which can be a cause of flooding. We're also looking at putting in a flood gauge that will give us better warning, and that information will be available. There is one near there, but we want to put in some more automated new equipment to allow them to be warned ahead of time and allow us to be warned at the state EOC as waters rise. But we're down there all the time. We're down there with FEMA. My staff is down there. We meet with them on a regular basis, almost weekly. And we're going to be there with them hand in hand throughout this whole process to do whatever we can to support them.
Is there an update on, an updated estimate on how much damage the two storms may have caused? I know at one point the governor said it may have been north of $1 billion.
I think our running estimate right now is about $1.5 billion in damage. Is that what's in the report right now? I think 1.5 is the damage, some of which is insurable and some of which is not.
And then the $574 million million in state aid, it said on the slide there that some of it will be reimbursed by the federal
Yeah.
government. Is there any sort of idea how much?
You know, it's complicated because each of the programs has a different reimbursement rate, but of the big number of the 570 million, I mentioned that about 297 million is transportation money, and we believe the bulk of that, you know, up to 90% of it, will be reimbursed by the federal government for that piece. On the remainder of the 277 million, it really varies, so I'm not sure what the end result of that will be, but there'll be a significant portion of that is direct state aid, not reimbursed. What those exact numbers are, I can't tell you today.
How's New Wildertown and Prattsville and other areas that you mentioned receiving this money so that they can continue to rebuild after?
The monies will be available, but we'll take applications beginning immediately. I don't think there's been an issue with drawing down money in Prattsville. Some of it, you know, rebuilding isn't always the quickest process, and you see in some areas it happens more quickly than in others. As I mentioned today, in Margaretville, those businesses are up and running, and many of them have been since before Memorial Day, put back together. The other areas that are a little slow, sometimes it's an issue of money. Sometimes there's a decision-making process. You know, you talk to the business owners and the homeowners, and they took some time to determine whether or not they wanted to invest the money to stay, and whether there was a plan to stay. And I think there is one at this point, and so you'll see more individuals, more businesses deciding, I'm committing, we're going to open our doors, especially with this additional state funding.
Has there been any long-term environmental damage in some of these areas, either because of the flooding or even medium-term environmental damage that will need to be rectified?
Well, Jerry mentioned the flood debris. There still is debris in some places in the state that will need to be cleared, but this was one of the first things that we did was very quickly begin debris mitigation. That's the most important immediate step that we could take. As you may recall, immediately after the storms, we waived Department of Environmental Conservation rules about taking debris out of the rivers and the creeks, and I believe we kept that open right through the end of the year last year so that individuals could remove the material, in some cases even burn it as well. So we suspended those rules. That helped us jumpstart clearing out the tributaries, which was very important. There are some areas that will continue to need, as Jerry mentioned, diversionary attention. As we were looking today in Delaware County, you know, there's one area on the Esopus there that probably can use an additional bulkhead wall to divert some water. And these will be long-term plans, I think, that you'll see throughout the state. In terms of environmental damage, I'm not aware of any significant environmental damage other than the ongoing need to deal with the diversion of the water. That's both storms together, 1.5, both storms together. It's a combination of both. You know, the public infrastructure, the roads is a big piece. So, you know, you got 300 million of it right there is just roads. There are probably some numbers that aren't included in there. We have, I think, about $50 million in the canal system is actually even over and above that 500 million that I mentioned today that the state's put in. But I think it's about evenly split between private and public infrastructure. I don't know if we have an estimate like that, but it would have been a significant amount of lost business. The businesses were closed for a long period of time. Could have been much worse than it was. You know, BAE Systems, Amphenol, other companies that decided to stay in New York when they clearly could have relocated. Those were very big, important decisions that these companies made with the state assistance.
Related to that, you mentioned how many business entities receive assistance, almost 300 in the county. Are you a sense of how many businesses have closed or decided not to come back? And also, any sense of any population losses in the areas?
I can only tell you anecdotally at this point is that we believe that the vast majority of businesses decided to stay in New York and reopen their doors. You know, that appears to be the case in community after community. You know, the bulk of these are going to be you have a lot in Broome County that were affected, and then you've got pockets in the other areas. So in our assessments, and we've had teams from ESD, from Housing Community Renewal, which also has quite a robust program of economic development. They literally sent teams out to go door to door through the hard-hit communities and sell the state programs, if you will, let people know that this was available. We opened these disaster recovery centers also locally. So part of this was a marketing effort to let the businesses know, you may not know what is out here. You think you're not insured, and so therefore you have to give up the ghost. And we wanted to come to them, into their communities, and say, that's not the case. We believe we have programs that can help you stay open and be a profitable business for your community.
Make a comment about the business. Let me also address the businesses. Historically, after disasters, about 50% of businesses that are impacted never recover. As a result of the governor's aggressive efforts and all the programs that were put in place by the state, I think we're going to see significantly greater numbers recover and do very well as time goes on.
Something like this happening again, that people, rebuild their homes, rebuild their businesses, just going to get nailed again at some future point. It's the government's role to encourage people to, rebuild.
Well, Eric, floods may be a fact of life in some of these areas. You can do some work with the rivers, but the rivers are the rivers. But that said, there are ways to manage and mitigate the damage. As an example, I visited a business that had gotten completely flooded out. I mean, the building was intact, but the interior had gotten just so wet and moldy that the entire floor had to be replaced. They used a flood-resistant, there's no such thing as flood-proof, but they used flood-resistant building materials so that the next time that the water is in that building, should that happen again, they won't have to tear that floor out again. It won't have the mold and the rot that you had. It'll get wet and the water will recede. They'll clean up the mud. They also built in drainage system into the floor to mitigate the water getting in and getting out in the first place. Typically the water gets in, it gets in through the windows and wherever else, through the cracks, and the water's in, it has nowhere to go. It takes a long time, that mud, to come out. They built drainage systems into the floor so the water will also leave more quickly. So there's actually a lot you can do, even anticipating that you're living in a flood-prone area, to maintain the structures and maintain the businesses.
Can I add a
Please.
comment, Howard? Yeah, to that question, I'd also add this fact about how the business grants worked. As I mentioned earlier, they were grants in the amount of up to $20,000 per qualifying business, but only to cover up to 50% of the expenses, of the qualifying expenses. So if you think about it, a business owner who's been through this experience has to put a lot of his or her own equity into rebuilding the business, because we're only doing half of, again, those qualifying expenses. And so they're not likely to make the state's not encouraging them to make the same mistake, if you will, because again, we're only meeting them halfway. They've got to do the rest. They've got to think hard about how they're going to reopen, where they're going to be.
Okay, we can take other questions offline if we need to. Thank you.
You mentioned an RFP.
Yep.
How there are communities all across that area that has been years about for cell phones.
Well,
Is that RFP extended to there?
Right now it's for this area of Schoharie Valley and the northern Catskills, so it covers a decent area. It's a pilot program. If it's successful, we'll do more. We also announced just earlier this week, the governor announced a $25 million broadband commitment, which, while it's not specifically cell phone service, does provide additional communications backstops. And we're going to communities around the state and asking them to come to us with proposals for improving their broadband service. And that's targeted largely at rural areas that have had difficulty with communications and cell service in the past. So it's a combination of all these programs together. Thank you very much.